Good morning, everybody. First of all, let me apologize for not having been able to be with you in person today, as much as I appreciate the work of Professor Linus van der Kerkhoven, and also to say that his work is really of world class and is important if we ever want to end this AIDS epidemic. We also greet Minister Maggie de Blok, whose leadership is really important because HIV is also not over in Belgium. Now, what I'll do is to quickly review where we are with the AIDS epidemic and what I think the challenges are. First of all, let's not believe what people say that the end of AIDS is in sight. It's not in sight at all, in spite of what we're hearing from the UN or from from the US or from a lot of the medical profession. It remains a global health crisis. Look at these figures. We know that close to 80 million people have been infected with HIV since 1981. That makes it the largest epidemic in modern times since the Spanish flu, and it continues. Currently, about 37 million people are living with HIV in the world, and there are 2 million new infections per year, like last year. The number of people who have died from AIDS is just staggering, close to 40 million people, and the death toll remains really high. Now, who would have thought that? I've been working on AIDS since the very beginning, since 1981, when at the Hospital for Tropical Diseases at the Institute of Tropical Medicine in Antwerp, we were seeing people coming from Central Africa, both Africans and Belgians who were living there with this new syndrome, a new syndrome that we now call AIDS. In these days it was said that this was a gay-related immune deficiency, but awful name, but I could never understand why a virus would care about the sexual orientation of its human host. And so indeed heterosexual transmission is the main mode of transmission in the world, even if in Belgium, for example, it's men who have sex with men who are the most affected. So here you see that in 1985, when there were only a few million people living with HIV, that the brunt of the infections were in Central Africa. When you take the picture today, it's very different. We have, of course, in Southern Africa, around South Africa and surrounding countries, and East Africa, where we have the highest prevalence of HIV, with countries where more than 15 to 20% of the adult population is infected. But where the epidemic is most rapidly progressing today is in the former Soviet republics, and it's driven there mostly by injecting drug use and the fact that there are no effective programs for political reasons. So that's the situation today. And when you take sub-Saharan Africa, HIV is the first cause of death in adults. By far, before malaria, before other causes of death, it's AIDS. Together with tuberculosis, which is also very frequent among people living with HIV. So still a major problem in parts of the world, certainly in sub-Saharan Africa. The costs are enormous of HIV. Here you see some estimates from UNAIDS, and this is the cost to deal with it, not in any case close, the economic cost of it. And so we're talking here about billions, not about millions, in terms of the needs to deal with this epidemic. Now, in 1996, something important happened. Thanks to investments by the academic researcher community, but also in the pharmaceutical industry, we came up with a treatment for HIV infection. And it is, as the military say, a game changer. You see here a man before treatment, he was about to die, and a few years later he has a healthy baby, and he's still under treatment, but his life has been saved. And today about 16 million people are benefiting from this therapy somewhere in the world. Now, in 1996, the wisdom then, if I may say so, was that these drugs are too complicated and too expensive to be used in developing countries, particularly in Africa, where the need is highest. And economists and specialists in health services and public health and international development, they all said this is not possible and spend a lot of time meeting to discuss why it's not possible, instead of spending that energy on trying to find a solution. And what they had not counted with was activism. People living with HIV were fighting literally for their life. And here you see a demonstration about 15 years ago in Durban, in South Africa, during the International AIDS Conference in Durban. And in July there will be this International AIDS Conference will go back to Durban. And people with HIV, activists, were really pushing for a decrease in the price of drugs and greater access. And that, after many years of activism, diplomacy, negotiations, led to a serious decrease in the price of antiretroviral drugs, so the anti-HIV drugs. And here is an example of Uganda, where in 1998 a treatment for 1 year for a person with HIV cost about $12,000 US. Far too much for most people. And then when I was head of UNAIDS, we went into a collaboration with some pharmaceutical companies, and the price went down by some time by 1/3. Great, but not enough. And then we had a combination of, as I said, activism, the change of laws and in India in terms of intellectual property, but also the exceptions to intellectual property laws that were agreed at the World Trade Organization in Doha in 2002, and with the appearance of generic manufacturers from India, we are now today at about $200 to $300 US per person per year. So less than $1 a day of life-saving medication. At the same time, even if a treatment is cheap, someone has to pay for it. Specific financing mechanisms were developed, and you can see here on this slide that the money that's available for fighting AIDS in low and middle income countries increased steadily, slowly between 1996 and 2001. But then in 2001 there was a big event at the UN General Assembly where 45 heads of state, presidents, prime ministers also, came together and agreed to to join efforts to defeat AIDS. And then you can see the funding for HIV went up dramatically. There was the creation of the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB and malaria. This is where many countries pool their resources, and Belgium is a major contributor to it, and they really have results. And then in 2003, President Bush in the US created PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which is spending billions of dollars every year to fight AIDS in developing countries. And so now we've come to about $16 billion every year in the fight against AIDS. So it's a combination of this that has led to results, because we can measure results. On this slide, that's from the latest UNAIDS report that came out in June. It shows that the number of people on antiretroviral therapy increased dramatically as of 2005. So it took nearly 10 years since the discovery of treatment before about 1 million people in Africa had access to it. So that shows how long it takes. But the results are there. You can see so the percentage of people who benefiting from antiretroviral therapy, and that's now about 45% in the world. But then also that the deaths from AIDS started to decline in about 2005, but they're still now at 1.1 million per year. Now, some people are always very optimistic, and I'm certainly an optimist, and here you see a cover of The Economist. This is already from 2011, where they say the end of AIDS, with a question mark. And there's no doubt that we've made enormous progress, that the 16 million people who are on antiretroviral therapy today, that they would, nearly all of them would have been dead without that therapy. So it's rare that we can measure so well progress, but we are far from over. The epidemic is still there. And the optimism was driven by another biomedical discovery, and that is that when you give treatment, someone with HIV, of course, the virus is suppressed in the body, and you can then, the person is less infectious for others, and also that you can use pills or vaginal gels, to prevent, to acquire HIV infection during sexual intercourse, be it for men who have sex with men or for women. All great breakthroughs, but in real life, we still have some big challenges. First of all, we still have about 22 million people who are not on treatment. That is the gap. So there's still a big effort to make. And that's important to make sure that they don't die, that they can have a normal life, be productive, have a family, whatever they want to do, and that they're less infectious. But problems. I mean, this treatment is for life. And taking a treatment every single day is quite a challenge. I mean, I take statins myself, and there are days that I forget them, but that's not a disaster. But when you do that, when you're under a therapy that's there to suppress a virus, if you forget for a few days, or you don't have access to the drugs because they're not available, or you're running out of money or whatever, that can be really bad, and you can have a relapse clinically, but also develop, the virus can develop resistance. So over time, the number of people who are adhering to treatment is, declines, and that's human, and it's true in Europe, it's true in other countries. We also are going into a crisis in terms of the availability of antiretroviral drugs. Here you can see that more than 60% of all antiretroviral drugs in sub-Saharan Africa are provided by 2 Indian generic manufacturers. There are only 10 in the world now. So if you 10, that's really risky, and the prices are so tight that the profit margin are too small, and one after the other is leaving the field. There are huge needs in terms of the raw materials that make up the drugs, the so-called API. It's enormous. Local production is not really taking off the ground, and we have really a major issue now for the future. Now, so that's on treatment. Good progress, but major obstacles to keep people in treatment and increase it. But then we also have what's at the end of the day extremely important, and that is that we've hardly seen any decline in new infections. More than 2 million last year. And when you see one region in the world, that's Eastern Europe and Central Asia, a huge increase in new infections. And most of the decrease in actually that we see in the world in new infections is due to a decrease in the transmission of mother to child, not in terms of sexual transmission. So that is a massive failure of prevention. And it shows that we're not going to treat ourselves out of this epidemic. It's really an illusion that what comes out in a neat clinical trial, that can be translated in a complex level of the population. So we need to do a much better job in terms of prevention. And look at the figures here also. In rural South Africa, this is from KwaZulu-Natal, where Durban is, in northeast South Africa, you see that by 16 years of age, already 8% of girls are HIV positive. And by the time they're 24, it's like 44%. So huge risk for infection, and this has to do with power relations, with gender-based violence, with poverty, and most of these girls, particularly, and the younger women, are infected by men older than they are themselves. So this corresponds to, in this community in KwaZulu-Natal, to an annual incidence, new infections of 9% per year. That's staggering. We see that also sometimes in populations of gay men, but this is a heterosexual population here. And so we should not think that we can fix the AIDS epidemic with just a biomedical approach. Many structural drivers, as we call it. I mean, I mentioned, the power relations between men and women, but also, alcohol is quite a driver. Discriminatory laws where homosexuality is banned, and driven underground. How can you expect to have programs that are going to be effective? So all this is something that we need to incorporate into our programs. And finally, all this costs money. And many countries, middle-income countries, they can handle that. They can fund it, and I don't think that we in high-income countries should pay for that. The problem there is often that they don't want to put the money in there where the epidemic is, like in injecting drug users or sex workers or men of sex with men. And that's particularly a problem in Eastern Europe, but also in some parts of Latin America and Asia. However, in the poorest countries in Africa, as you can see from this complicated slide from a report that I published in The Lancet last year, that it would require 50 to 60% of total health expenditure by the government to pay for HIV treatment and prevention. That, of course, is not possible, and that's where international solidarity remains important. I should say that it's not only enough to have the right tools, you also need the people to do it. And if you see this world map here, you can see that the overwhelming majority of people living with HIV are living in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. But when you look at, on the right side, the number of physicians in the world, then you see that that's where the deficit is, and physicians and other healthcare workers. So we need innovative solutions there. So we've made great progress, and many lives have been saved, but it's not enough. It's not enough because the societies don't want to deal with sometimes with the big issues in terms of sexual transmission, but also the tools we have are not good enough. In order to end this epidemic, we need two things, in addition to do more of the same that we're doing now. And one is a vaccine that will prevent people from becoming infected, and two, a cure. So that instead of, taking treatment for the rest of your life, for decades, that we can have a cure, and a cure means at some point you can stop therapy. That's not just a fantasy. We know that, for example, for hepatitis C, a form of hepatitis, today that can be cured. It's expensive and so on, but in 6 to 8 months you can just get rid of the virus. For HIV, we're not there yet. This is where we need to invest in research. It's a very difficult and long road, but the only way to find out, just as for developing a vaccine, is to do it, to invest in it. There is serious investment in HIV vaccine work. We need the same thing now for HIV cure. And in the US, there is an HIV cure initiative, and this brings together academia, businesses, pharmaceutical companies, biotechs, and so on, and that's what we need, and that's why I think we all need to support, Linus and his great work. So thank you for your attention, and as I always say, no time to lose, because the longer we wait, the more difficult it will be to defeat this terrible epidemic. Thank you.